Houston, Sr., and my mom and dad was Joseph and Ada Self, and they run a business called the Country Kitchen, Sells Country Kitchen.
My grandparents were Ada and Joseph Self. They were two of the kindest people I have ever known. Ada and Joe were both born in 1899. She was born in Kentucky, he was born in southern Indiana. They came together in the 1930s, late 1920s, early 1930s, because she preached at a church. She was a minister of a non-denominational Pentecostal church in Crystal, Indiana, where Joseph attended. They brought their extended family, their blended family, his kids, her kids, their kids, to Monroe County, Indiana in early 1937. And during that time, they were really poor. First they lived in a log cabin with all these kids, a tiny place. And then Joseph and Ada bought land on contract, probably, from members of their church. And this was on Old Highway 37, 7 miles south of Bloomington. Through the hard times of the Depression and the war years, Ada and Joe struggled to get by, but Joe is a builder and always, putting up some sort of structure. First a big house to house all the kids, and then the restaurant, and then eventually the motel. And this is the story of how they entered into the late 1940s and early 1950s American culture of motoring, of how when they decided to open a restaurant, it became a way of life for them and for their children and their grandchildren. Ada and Joe loved feeding people, either their souls or their hearts or their bellies.
We moved into the log cabin, I think it's in 36, and it's set right there where the old Starlight Theater is now. And right down below the Starlight Theater was a building where I went to school, and I guess it'd be my second grade of school.
It was terrible. It was really, I remember the log house. But Mother went into it, and her and Daddy and all of us that could help clean the house up. I remember Mother using lye to clean the walls and stuff because it hadn't been lived in, and we all lived in that log house. And to my memory, at that time there was 12 of us. It was his kids, her kids, and our kids. And so we lived in that little log house. And then below the log house, it was up on a hill, it's where the Starlight Theater is now. in Bloomington, and the little log house, we would walk to the school, which was they converted a grocery store into a one-room schoolhouse. And I remember my first school, or my first grade, was in that one-room schoolhouse. And we just walked down the hill to that school. So eventually then, they bought this property that was just right up the road. And they began to build their own home. And I can remember that as children, when Daddy started to build the house, we didn't have it finished, but we did have a place to sleep.
When the saints go marching in, when the saints go marching in, Lord, I want to be in that number when the saints go marching in.
Mom was a preacher and her dad was a preacher.
I can remember Grandpa, mother's dad, in Kentucky. We'd go down in Kentucky after she moved to Indiana from Kentucky, and in my grandpa's church.
We all played some sort of instrument, mandolins and guitar.
And I'm going to tell something on my brother Woody. I was this 15 months difference, I think, in us, and my grandpa just had everybody to participate. And so when he got done with the sermon, he said, "Does anybody have anything on their heart that they would like to tell, or in a song or anything?" Because he was really open like that. And this was in his church. And I remember my brother Woodrow, he held his hand up and he said, "Well, God bless his heart." Said, come on up here." And when he went up on the pulpit, he said, "I want to sing." And Grandpa says, "Okay." He said, "Let's let him sing." And he reared back and began to sing in the Yellow Rose of Texas. And I remembered, I didn't think that was very good for the church, but he let him sing it. And then when he got done, Grandpa says, "Let's all give him a hand." Said, "Bless his heart." Said, "Thank the Lord for that boy."
And of course, Mom waited, but she was sure proud of you. I remember her coming to my baptism when I got baptized up at Clear Creek Church, and probably when I was in 8th grade. And it was a revival that, I had come forward at the revival, and then a day or two or night later, they did the baptism, and she was right out there to watch that. And I also remember going out there when she preached, and there was a pole barn out behind the restaurant. Papa built a pole barn and had a tin roof on it, and it just was open sides, and then they had like a stage-like thing out there. She'd get up on the stage and prance back and forth and wipe her sweat, and amen, praise the Lord, hallelujah, And I was just a kid, so that really made an impression on me.
The only thing I can remember is that it's hard to explain, because it's what's inside you is the church and how you feel. It's more like karma. Mm-hmm. What you put out there, you get back. If you put terrible things, terrible things. I believe all things have a purpose, and I think that was part of their ministry. Mm-hmm. What you put out there, it'll come back. She was a prophet in a way, and she said a lot of things that happened, or that would happen, that happened.
Mother never gave up her ministry, even whenever they was in the restaurant. Sometimes we would go to down even as far as Owensboro, Kentucky, for a revival, and of course, Mother she played the guitar, and Mother began her ministry when she was 12 years old.
At some point, I remember someone telling me that Papa Joe had a vision. But the Lord came to him and said, Papa Joe, I want you and Mama Edie to create the White Flag Campground. And I want you to create that so if someone needs food and they don't have it, or if someone needs a place to stay and they don't have a place, that you would provide that for them. So Papa Joe made or had made a flag. And the flag said the White Flag Campground. And he put a flagpole out in front of the big house. And he put the flag on the flagpole.
My recollection is that there was, in her eyes, there would be a time when death would be overcome by the Spirit of God, and that we would all be more Christ-like, and there would be peace. And that was her, mainly her goal. We was all created to love one another, and that whatever and whoever we was connected. She used to say, I have a little end of a great big thing.
Will forever be on the land and on the sea, but the thought that blesses me that God is, God is, God is, God is, God is, God has been, and God will be, God will be, God is, God is, God is, God is, God has been, God will be, and God is, God is.
I remember her having us, the smallest kids, me, myself, and my half-sister, Josephine, and Woodrow, and I believe it was Obadiah. Woodrow's my full brother, and Obadiah was, he was my half-brother. But I remember we'd have to go, when we go to church, we'd have to sing, get up on the stage and sing, pulpit and sing, we're all little workers. And we'd just throw our hands up, and I remember singing, we all are little workers, little workers, little workers.
Go back, way back on music. Mom used to take us to church, and we all had an instrument we'd play and sang, and she'd collect money from the public, and lots of times bought her meals as far as bean flour and the staples, I call it, that we had to eat. And that was one way we survived, was through all of us enjoying music. It was back 36 and 37 when we all was doing that. It started out in Paola, and we did a lot of it there, but and then Bedford, and then we went from Bedford to Bloomington, and we've actually sang right there on the square here in Bloomington.
And all of Mama Edie's children really know how to talk. Many of them know how to sing. They're all musically talented. And I know back when they had the band, and Georgia May could tell you more about this, but she says they had the band and they had the revivals. I think that's the way they made their income. But they had the family band, which was part of having the revival. And she said that my Aunt Georgia May says she can still see my dad up there with his tambourine.
So I would say probably in the real early 40s, sometime in that area, they bought the property. But the first building that was built on the 9 acres was built from sawmill lumber, and it was a resident at the time, but it would soon, or a little later on, would become a barn, and that's where we kept the animals and so forth. The second building that was built was the permanent house. It had approximately 1,600 square feet in it, and that building was built so it could take care of the large family that we all had. And that was, it had sort of a Dutch roof on it, and it served the purpose for many years for our family to have our dinners and enjoy.
So the first building that I remember is the big house. And it sat on the north side of the property. And were you ever in the big house? I love the big house. So it had a porch on the front, and you would enter in the front door, and you entered into what I call Mammal Whitehead's bedroom. And on the left, which was on the south side of the south front of the building, was a great big room, and it was like the kitchen, the dining room, the living room combined. And since they had 12 children, then we can see why they needed that huge room.
That I remember about the ministry is having the ministry in the old house out there. We had they had a big living room, and they would have church services, prayer services, and that type of stuff in the house.
In the big old Dutch roof house?
In the big house. I don't remember them building the house or anything
That was
like
before
that.
you were born.
Yes, but I remember I was young, very young, and I can remember we had meetings in there, and they were praying and different things.
It was all through the 50s that the restaurant went from a grocery store and gradually got into a restaurant business by mother making sandwiches for some of the truck drivers and them finding a place to dump what we call the scrap stone, or the stone that had been rejected from some of the mills.
And then they built the restaurant, and they called it the Self's Country Kitchen. And from there, the restaurant began to grow so big that they discarded the grocery store, and it was just the cafeteria, big cafeteria.
One of the quotations that Mother used to use a lot was the stone that the builders rejected, came out of Scripture and Psalms. And she related that a lot to the scrap stone and the stones that were laying around at that time in a lot of quarries where they had thrown it away because they had used the best parts of the stone, and maybe some of the stone that they threw away had a glass seam or a crow's foot or something that would cause the builder to say, don't think this stone's good enough to go into a big building in New York or wherever. But the quarries they was kind of anxious, and the mills were kind of anxious to get rid of a lot of the stones, so they had workers sometimes that would bring in the rock in their dump trucks looking for a place to dump it. And at that time, Dad was in need of filler rock for building roads and for building the country kitchen. So he put it to work and began to add a little mortar with it, and it was in the late 40s and the early 50s when he was gathering up a lot of the stone, and sometimes when the workers came in to dump the stones, well, he would ask them if they're hungry, and they would bring them in and feed them and give them a dinner, and they went on down the road, and they were very content and happy, and the mills were happy to get rid of the rock, and Dad and Mom was happy to get the stone. So there was a lot of rock hauled in there, and a lot of it went to build the country kitchen with.
Well, I just remember going in that old screen door and letting it slam as you walk in there in the summertime, and I think it was linoleum on the floor, and she had those chrome chairs and tables, you know, and they'd scrape on the floor when you'd move around. And she'd be standing back there behind the steam table in her white dress, and her white anklets and white shoes, and that's my memory of her curly hair. And back there dipping those plates full of food for, I think it was 90 cents the first time I remember. You get everything on that plate you could, or she would put it on there. And then she'd raise it to $1. So it was $1 a plate then.
And she wore a white uniform, and Dad had white pants and white shirt.
And a cap.
And a little cap like they have at Steak and Shake, but it didn't have Steak and Shake on it. But that's the type hat he wore.
Yeah.
And but they had also, when he had his gas station, he had Phillips 66 on his shirt, printed on his shirt too.
On the expanded in the restaurant, and just to the south of the steam table, you know, here's the entryway to go back to the kitchen, but just to the south of that, they made an ice cream bar. Well, I always thought the reason they made the ice cream bar was to keep Sharon out of mischief. So that was her little toy over there. She made milkshakes, ice cream cones, and sundaes. And of course she had the cute little white hat and the cute little white dress and apron, which they all did, which the ladies that worked behind the steam table that I remember, Ada Self, Estelle Goodman, Mama Whitehead, and Lily Sharon.
And this was a thriving business back in the 50s. And it all started somewhere in the late 40s. And it started as a little grocery business across the street. It started out as a small grocery store, and Mother needed someone to help her in it, so I was glad to be 50-50 interested in it, to where we partnerships. And about the main thing we sold was canned stuff, and she would make a few sandwiches. And then it branched out after we had the building across the street from that, known as Self's Country Kitchen. Then we did a lot of work, extra work, and we built a grocery store on the south side of the building. And my wife, which we got married in the meantime, we got married in 50, and we decided that we would go into the grocery business. Well, the grocery store was a pretty good sized business at that time, and the restaurant on the north side of the building, there was actually two buildings there that was joined together, and they was pretty busy with the restaurant, so they leased out the grocery store to my wife Dee and I. And one of the memories that I remember there was it was a truck that pulled up, a large truck, a semi-truck, matter of fact, and it was loaded with watermelons all the way up, and it was broke down in front of the parking lot right in front of the store. And their insurance said they would pay for the watermelons if they could unload them. So the gentleman that drove the truck come in and offered to sell a semi-load of watermelons to the grocery store, and with Mom's help and very, very little money we spent, we bought a semi-load of watermelons. And now how to get rid of them and how to sell them. First thing we did was put a sign up, 3 for $1. Well, we still need to market more watermelons, so my folks knowing Jimmy Hayes, and he was in the market business at the time, known as Hayes Market and in Bloomington. And he had a pickup truck, and he had one of his workers to come down and start hauling watermelons out of that bunch of watermelons by the truckloads. And we made him a very, very good deal on it, and in return we we had a nice profit in it. For a while, we wondered if any of them was going to make it till we got them sold, but there was a few that didn't make it. And of course, Mom believing in not to waste anything, and Dad was the same way. They fed them to the hogs.
But they worked from daylight till dark period all the time, both of them. And at that time, they had the motel. At one time, they had the motel, they had the restaurant, they had the grocery store, and they had the gas pumps.
My Aunt Georgia May told me that when they first started the restaurant, that they didn't have a steam table, that Mama 80 served family style. And her biggest crowds were the church people. And they would come in after church. Now, whether they came Wednesday night after church, I don't know, but she just said after church. And Mama 80 would put the food in the big bowls with a spoon and bring them out and set them down for family style. And then later on, of course, she had the steam table. The restaurant was always so clean. And it was bright and cheery. But you picked up your tray and you put it, on the sliding bars here. And you got your silverware and your napkin. And you got to pick a salad. You got to pick a dessert. Oh, did they have good pies. And one time, Mama 80 had a lady that came in just specially to make pies. She made the best chocolate pie.
The cook and Mom did all the cooking. And she had, when your Aunt Estelle came back from Phoenix, she helped in there.
Uh-huh.
And I didn't do a whole lot of cooking. I didn't cook anything. But she would have over 100 and some pounds of chicken that she would fry and put in a big pressure cooker. On a typical day, she would have pulled pork and maybe some type of beef, but all kinds of like chicken and noodles or that type of stuff almost every day. And she always had corn, peas, mashed potatoes, sweet potatoes, kale, almost any kind of vegetable that you would want, and a salad and pie. Had all different kinds of pies.
And you moved on down to the steam table, where she always had fried chicken, she had roast beef, and my Aunt Georgia May said she had the best roast pork. So she asked Mama 80 one day, she said, what do you do to your roast pork to make it so good? And she said, I put prunes in it. So anyhow, and she always had homemade, real mashed potatoes and corn and green beans. She had sweet potatoes. She had noodles and dressing. And so you got all of that. Your full course meal with your dessert and your drink and your bread for $1 a plate. And people just flocked in there. Well, you could tell from the pictures of the restaurant that the parking lot was full.
I remembered when Lyle's Potts took them in the school bus to the state fair, and they always stopped on their way back at the country kitchen and ate. Way
Really?
back from the state fair.
And that would have been in the 50s.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
The old jukebox was bought at the auction by my wife and I at Hancock's auction. That's been years ago. And the old jukebox was came with a bunch of 78s on it. And that was back before they even thought of 45s, RPMs I'm talking about. But Dad treasured that old jukebox, and he had a lot of Christmas songs on it and a lot of old-time songs on it, Roy Acuff and those type of songs. And it was played right there in the country kitchen for several years, and he thought a lot of that.
And also remember there was a big jukebox back between the two doors on that east wall. And the guy would come, I don't know how often he came, but if we went out right after he'd been there, he'd put a bunch of free tunes on there. You know, we could play it without putting money in it. So I loved that.
What kind of music was on it that you liked?
Well, see, I'm thinking probably late 40s and 50s. I really don't remember, except probably country. It was always country, I think. Well, not always, but country. And of course, when I was in high school, see, I got out of 8th grade in '53. So between '53 and '57, I was in high school, and that's when Elvis and some of the rock and roll came into being, you know. So we like to play that on there.
Oh, and the jukebox, remember that? First time I ever heard the Beatles was on Mama 80's jukebox. Yeah. I Want to Hold Your Hand. That was it.
Huh.
Yep. And I thought, God, these guys are really good. Turned out I was right about that. No, she was a large appreciator of music.
And Joe too.
And Joe too, and the whole family. I think all of our family plays. If we're not musicians, we're artistic.
Then that was part of their entertainment, was to have music going while they was sitting there eating their dinners and enjoying their dinners.
And I remember sometimes we'd have family, like Christmas or other get-togethers out there, and we'd all go to the restaurant, you know, and set a big long table up, and that's where we'd have our goings on. And then after they built the store part on, and I don't know whether it was still open or not, is when your dad and Bonnie and all them, Roger and everybody got their musical instruments, you know, and we'd go out there like once a week and they'd all play music. And you know, I may be a little bit mixed up with when they would all come up to the garage, because any, like, birthdays and whatever, Daddy would get his garage all cleaned out, and they had their music up there. So Roger played the drums, Woody played the bass fiddle, I guess it's called, the big thing. And of course Bonnie played the piano. Oh yeah, Alice and Estelle played their guitars. Yeah. And different ones would sing. I never did sing. But they really had a good time.
And then, of course, we all know that Woody can play the guitar. Can Bonnie play the guitar? I'm assuming she can. I don't know how she
think
learned
she
to play the
sang.
keyboard.
She taught herself.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
She plays better than anyone I know. And I have a little tidbit about the jukebox. Whenever Harrison and Lula and Eddie and Larry and Susie were coming to Bloomington, Mama 80, when she knew they were just about to get there, she would go back and put, I think you had 6 plays for a quarter. I think there were 75 records, 78 RPMs. Is that right? 78 RPMs. Anyhow, and she would play Wake Up a Little Susie by the Everly Brothers, because Susie was coming.
One thing I remember when Luann was born, and she was Mama's first great-grandchild. And she was so tickled when I brought her out there for the first time, and she come out there at the table where we sat and just grabbed her up. Let me nurse that baby! And she just grabbed her up and took over. Ivan and Janie had Pam in September after I had Luann in June. And Pam Janie and Pam had come home. And I remember going out there and Mama holding each one of them. You know, both of them in her 2 arms. She's, you know, how she was built, and she just held those babies up there. I think I've got a picture of that.
I'd love to see
Yeah,
that.
yeah, she loved the babies.
Yeah.
But me and Marilyn Rush would go to town almost every Saturday, and we'd go to the show, and it would cost us a quarter, and sometimes 35 cents, depending. And we would go to Woolsworth and have club sandwich, bacon and lettuce and tomato club sandwich, and that was 65 cents. And at Mom's, you could get a hamburger for 25 cents.
Mm-hmm.
And you get a whole dinner for $1
Right.
for everything.
Right.
And then they raised it to $1.25, and she still did good, you know.
I can remember they had a big crowd that would come on Sundays. They'd come from everywhere. My mother was a great cook, and they would have on Sundays they would have well, just anything you'd think about it. They'd have the beef, the chicken, and like homemade pies.
Later, after it was larger, there was a door here, So the ladies at the steam table could go back into the kitchen, and then there was a door here so the rest of us could go back in that area if we wanted to. And then on the wall right behind the steam table wall is where the big stoves were. Great, I remember them being great big black stoves where she had big pots of food every day that she must have gotten up at 4:30, 5 o'clock every day and started cooking. But she also served breakfast because she had menu also if you wanted to order off the menu. But she started her lunch and dinner then real early in the morning.
There would be, at even an ordinary Sunday, they'd be 150 to 200 people, easy. That was like just at lunch times and stuff, because they'd be people coming in the afternoon later. But she always had, you had as much as you wanted, but if you wanted more, you had to eat what you had. You didn't do like you do at the, some of these smorgasbord things or whatever, where you go in and you leave a half a plate and go back and get something else. And she always dipped it out for you. She always gave you a good meal. And there was never anyone that came in that didn't have any money that ever left hungry. Never. And
Mama was a real take charge type of person. I figure that's where I got my personality. Yeah. Several of us probably. But yeah, I think she was pretty much the driver, behind everything. She worked really hard. She was on her feet so much.
on Sunday, Easter, she has fed as many as almost 500 people.
Okay.
And that was after she had the other part built on. They'd done away with the grocery store and
Right.
put the restaurant over on the other side.
Right. The dining
But,
area was
yeah,
where the
all the
grocery
dining
store
area
used to be.
was
Yeah.
was all.
Mother's Day, events like that, Memorial Day, Mother's Day. It was the place to go. She was the best. She made the best whipped sweet potatoes, covered it with marshmallows and Red Hots, all that sort of thing. Remember her always having that hairnet on. She seemed huge to me at the time. She was not so huge, but she had a huge presence. And she ruled the roost. She was definitely the matriarch of a very large family. Papa Joe was funny. He was the guy with a sense of humor, and he wore a hat a lot of times. And he made up little songs for us kids all the time. But for the life of me, all I can remember is going, hoop-de-doop-de-doop-de-doop.
She had the biggest hug. She loved everybody. She loved her children. She loved her grandchildren. She loved her customers. And she always made over all of us. And I know you feel the same way, but I felt like I was always very special and so safe. When I was there with Mama Lady and Papa Joe, they made me feel so safe as a child, and I loved staying there.
My earliest memories of the self-country kitchen is how big it was and how people would come in and go, and Grandma Edie always having laughing and enjoying people. And of course, I was 5 or 6 years old. I always remember getting the push-up orange sherbet ice creams. That was my favorite. And big Cokes in a glass bottle in a machine that you had to bring the Cokes all the way around. And the kitchen was set up where you come in, you paid your money, and then you walked around, and they would dip your food out for you. You just say, I want this or I want that, and they would dip your food out for you. But then you could come back as many times as you wanted, not just because I was a grandkid, but anybody could do that. And the milk was in the old-fashioned dispensers where you had a big silver machine, and you'd pull it out and pour it, big old glass of foamy milk. It wasn't in a carton or anything like that. And I just remember it being a joyful place. It was a place where people came and ate and enjoyed their times with, it felt like family, even though you were maybe a restaurant customer.
The other thing I remember about the restaurant, Mama told, on Sundays, people would be lined out the doors. We usually didn't go out there on Sunday because, they'd be standing lined out the doors. And we went out there one day and Mama said, oh, we had all these students come out there, you know, they discovered this home cooking. And these boys said, oh, it's been so long since we've had real butter, you know, and she said, it's oleo. They didn't know the difference. That's what they called it then, oleo. And yeah, she'd have so many vegetables, and she always put marshmallows on top of her
Sweet potato.
sweet potatoes, yeah. And I thought that made them too sweet, you know, but that's the way she fixed her sweet potatoes. And then I think she invented this recipe of making a cake, and it was in one of those great big square pans, you know. And then she'd poke holes in it with toothpicks, I believe she said, and then pour like Jell-O or something down in there to make it real moist. So, yeah, the kitchen was in the back of the building there, and a wall came out, and as I recall, there was a real wide opening then to walk out right in behind the steam table. So it was easy for her to come and go through there. So, and I felt real important when I got to go back in the back. So while Mother and Daddy were sitting there visiting with Mama, I'd walk out there and see Mama Whitehead and visit with her. And she was always sitting and sewing. So I really loved Mama Whitehead.
Mama Whitehead would sit kind of in the middle of the kitchen area and just peel potatoes. Like, it seemed like she peeled potatoes nonstop. Perfectly. She could do it all, like, you know, with one peeling and just be perfect potatoes. She was the queen. And I don't remember her saying a whole lot. She was kind of quiet.
But Mama Whitehead used to sit there and peel.
I remember Mama Whitehead sitting
Yeah.
there and peeling potatoes.
Yeah.
And
I've
I
got
remember
her
sitting
chair.
there with her and peeling potatoes. I
Yeah,
was pretty young.
everybody peeled
got into
potatoes,
peeling
yes,
potatoes, yeah.
they did. That was a job.
Yeah.
100 pounds is a lot of potatoes
That's a
to peel.
lot of potatoes.
To peel by hand.
Yeah.
And then sometimes I'd go in there and wash some of the dishes just to have something to do. I just remember those big old stainless steel sinks, you know. There were 3 sinks, because one you scrape the garbage off in and rinse the dishes, you know, first. And then you'd wash them, and then you'd rinse them, and then you got to dry them by hand and everything. So in her great big old pans that she cooked in. And I remember her saying one time that, well, she raised all those kids, and when they were gone, only thing she knew how to do was cook big bunches of food, so she opened a restaurant.
One of my favorite times at the restaurant was at Christmas time. And Mama Lady and Papa Joe invited all their children. I think I have this right when I say 12. I don't know if they invited all 12, but I remember most of them. And their spouses, and of course then I got to see all my cousins, and those were beautiful times. And they always offered up a Thanksgiving for the food and gave the blessing.
And there was several of us children, and there was a lot of them that came down to visit when they had a Christmas party or something, and I couldn't tell you how many numbers there was of us, but our whole family would meet there sometimes. And
At the restaurant.
at the restaurant and have dinner there and enjoy our Christmas.
We had Christmas, and all of them was in that. You've probably seen that picture. Anyway, they're at the restaurant, and they're all sitting and standing, and all of us are in the picture.
That's what I remember. I remember huge family gatherings. And since Mom had 11 brothers and sisters, my grandmother had 3 husbands, and so it was a large family, and we all gathered at the restaurant for big Christmas and family events. And it was like filling a restaurant with family. And she cooked like she was cooking for a restaurant, because we had a steam table full of food, and that's what we did. And so that was the big gathering. That was what we did when I was a little kid. That was the big Christmas, going over to the restaurant. And she always had a tree up, and everybody had presents. think we drew names because all of us were poor. And it was just a great gathering. All the cousins were there.
The restaurant was built first, and then the motel came along, and it was a fifth building that was built.
So then Daddy began to fix a motel. I think it's eight rooms, a motel, and then they built a motel office right up by the restaurant.
What kind of renters or tenants did he have in the motel?
They would just come by like you would on vacation, vacationers and that type of stuff. The little mom and pop motel. And, you know, the rooms weren't that bad. I mean, he went to Buck Lemons, I think, and bought his beds and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, about all I remember is when we'd go out there to eat, Papa Joe would be out there with that saw with the dust flying everywhere, you know, and him being covered with stone dust. And I think he was putting split face on that stone or just cutting the stone. I was only in the rooms, you know, a time or two when he was building them. I know they were very kind of primitive, you know. I think they just had concrete floors and just very simple.
Then the next building that I remember is the motel. And I just remember it being constructed, and there were several piles of stone out in front of the building, and Papa Joe and Woody, and they would sing. Papa Joe and Woody would sing as they did their work. And they always acted like they enjoyed the work, that it wasn't work at all, that it was play.
And then there was this motel. I think there were 6 rooms. I can't remember that. But Papa would clean the rooms, and I got to help him sometimes, which I liked to do a lot. And he had this apple cellar. Do you remember that? He had an apple cellar. It was right between the little house, or the office. It was under the office. That's what was the apple cellar. And he kept apples in there. And he also kept clean linen in there. So when you put the fresh linen on the beds, they smelled like, they were cold and they smelled like apples. And I always thought that was awesome.
My mother and my daddy, they fixed their living quarters in the office of the motel office, and it was up by the restaurant. But they would get up in the morning then and just go into the restaurant and prepare the meals, and they was open 7 days a week.
So, and then at night, after they had the motel, at night when they would go, they slept out in the, after I got married and left, they slept out in the motel, in the office part of the motel. They had a bedroom back there where they had a little place. Dad finally built a slide where he didn't have to deal with people coming in and not knowing who they were.
Down the construction end of the building, it was built by using a lot of the scrap rock, and some of it we had to repitch and resurface to make it fit into places. And as I remember one time that I was into the masonry business at that time, and they was Dad was doing a lot of the splitting and breaking rock, and he would always cut the rock before it was ready to go into the wall and have it ready for me. And he would mark each rock individual and say, this is 9 inches and 5/8 or whatever. And when I got ready to lay it, I'd call out, give me a 10-inch rock, and he said, well, I've got one here, 9 5/8. Can we use it? And I said, I guess we can, and we'd stick it in the wall.
My blessed Lord, has won my heart, and from His love I'll never part. My blessed Lord has won my heart, and from His love I'll never part. Ain't gonna grieve my Lord anymore.
and my mom worked hard to making the restaurant work out. And a lot of people came down and had fun. And of course, if you got all you want to eat for $1, but if you wanted another plate, well, that was fine too. But one thing for sure, if you didn't eat it, you'd have to pay for the second and third plate. And if you did eat it, sometimes she'd give you a cake of bubble gum and pat you on the back and say you've done a good job. So she tried to keep everybody fed, even people that came along sometimes and didn't even have money to pay. She always managed to see that they got food.
There was this gentleman that he had a big black bag, and you could tell he'd been probably at that back then he was homeless for a long time. He was just a bum that went from here to there. And anyway, when he came in, he had a beard, and he just didn't look good at all. And so he came in, of course coffee was a nickel. And so he came in and he said, asked Mom if she could spare him a cup of coffee. And she asked him where he was going. He told her he was going to, I don't even remember, somewhere down in maybe Tennessee or Alabama, I don't know, it's south. And so she was asking him how far he, had come, and he said, well, really didn't know, because I remember the conversation. And so anyway, she said, you're hungry? And so he said, yeah, I am. So she goes and gets him the biggest plate, of just everything, brings it there, and he automatically bows his head. And so while he's praying, Mom being like she is and everything. So she goes back and he tells her, he says, he says, I can wash dishes. And she says, well, I do need a dishwasher.
Will the circle be unbroken by and by, Lord, by and by? There's a better home awaiting in the sky, Lord, in the sky. Now, during the time of the late 50s and the early 60s, they were in the process of building a new 37 highway that would possibly close off some of the restaurants' traffic. Now, Mom and Dad, they depended a whole lot on the through traffic in order to keep their business at a high peak.
I remember Mom saying over and over, oh my Lord, when that highway comes by, we won't have no business. The business will be gone because there won't be anybody traveling. They'll have the highway, the bypass, going around. And, but as it turned out, it didn't happen until after the business was gone,
Yeah.
But she said that
And
so
she was
many
worried
times.
about
She
it.
was very worried about it because they wouldn't have the business,
The drive-by.
Yeah. But now in the
So it
restaurant,
was in the planning stage then?
It was in the
when-
planning
when-
stage,
When
uh-huh.
Grandma was still
yeah,
with us,
yeah.
yeah.
And that's about it. Then Mamaw died, and that was kind of the end of the restaurant. I think my parents took it over after that for a while. But no one ran it like she did. And then the highway, of course, was bypassed by the new 37 and now I-69. So that became more or less a grand 2-lane highway or road. And that kind of killed business along that road, kind of the end of the country kitchen. And I believe today it's been converted into a very large ranch of some sort with a private individual living there.
And at her funeral, there were 700, I think, that signed the book. And there was probably that many again outside that couldn't get in.
Thank